The valley where Florence stands today originated from the draining of an ancient lake. It was here some 30,000 years ago that the first groups of human beings settled. The heart of today's city was inhabited in the 10th century BC by a people whose civilization is called Villanovian. Discovered at the end of the 18th century, the tombs of the Villanovians have returned the typical biconical cinerary vases. From the hut shape of several cinerary vases, we can reconstruct the first habitations that rose on the right bank of the river Arno. Perhaps it was precisely a flooding of the river in the 8th century BC that caused this people to transfer to the surrounding higher ground. In the 8th century BC, Florentine territory is involved in the development of the Etruscan civilization, the most important of pre-Roman Italy. Several family groups, whose wealth is well documented by monumental tumuli, settle on the hills surrounding the Arno River Valley. A large Etruscan center develops in the 5th century BC at Fiesole, one of the hills that rises over Florence. The remains of an imposing circle of walls, the temple, and numerous archaeological remains speak to us of a powerful city that controlled the entire territory and the main routes of communication. In the 1st century BC, following their conquest of Fiesole, the Romans found Florentia at the narrowest point of the river Arno. The limits of the square-plan city are marked by a circle of walls built in brick. Though the small Roman city is still recognizable in the very regular streets of the center, nothing today remains of the sumptuous buildings that must have adorned it. The remains of the Capitoline Temple were discovered in today's Piazza della Repubblica. In Piazza della Signoria, the remains of baths, and a large fullonica, a works for washing and dyeing wool. Palazzo Vecchio rises on the remains of the theatre, while the amphitheatre can still be recognized by observing the position of the buildings that rose on its foundations. It is a rich and populated Florentia that sees the arrival of the Syrian merchants who introduced Christianity. The spread of the new religion leads to the building of the first churches located outside the walls. With the crisis of the Roman Empire, Florence too in the 5th century is beset with barbaric invasions which mark the beginning of a long period of decadence and abandon. Continuous battles and the spreading of disease are indeed the cause for the escape to the countryside. The few city inhabitants that remain live within a new, smaller circle of walls constructed using materials recovered from the abandoned ancient Roman buildings. Many once inhabited areas now become cemeteries. Only with Charlemagne's coming to Italy does Florence show the first signs of recovery. The city again populates, and new walls are built following the Roman plan. In 1115, at the death of Countess Matilda di Canossa, the commune has virtually already been formed. The Florentine Republic is initially ruled by 12 councils, a council and a parliament, but at the beginning of the 1200s, a foreign podestà is sought to avoid internal favoritisms. During this period, government is under the control of the magnates, the class for the most part formed by land-owning nobles. In their struggle for communal government, the magnates are divided into two political parties, the Guelphs, supporters of the Pope, and the Ghibellines, who side with the emperor. Despite a climate of fierce internal struggles, the development of commerce leads to the affirmation of a new and powerful social group, the merchant middle class, organized into associations called guilds. Nobles can now accede to public posts only if they belong to a guild. The artisans, and more modest merchants, organized into the minor guilds, constitute the lower classes, which, though already participating in government, soon claim greater power. The nobles, the middle and lower classes, contend for the leadership of the city during the 1300s. Despite the complex political situation, during the Middle Ages, Florence lives a period of great development, which is evidenced by its incredible growth, partially halted by the plague of 1348, and by the construction of the monuments which characterize it still today. In 1115, at the death of Countess Matilda di Canossa, the commune has virtually already been formed. The Florentine Republic is initially ruled by 12 consuls, a council and a parliament, but at the beginning of the 1200s, a foreign podestà is At the stroke of the year 1000, after the nightmare of the end of the world, new hopes and religious fervor take shape in the construction of grandiose churches, which religious symbols become the emblem of power of the rising city-states. In Florence, the baptistry takes on its present forms. Santa Reparata is further enlarged. The church of San Miniato is built on one of the hills overlooking the city as a monumental treasure chest on the death site of the first Florentine martyr. The veneration of saints' remains is one of the devotional aspects that leads thousands of pilgrims from northern Europe to follow the Via Francigena down to Rome. Before the year 1000, the monasteries, organized like autonomous little towns, had been the main cultural centers. In fact, here, the monks devoted part of their day to the patient work of copying texts. In the 1200s, the new religious orders are born, which inside the growing city concentrate on preaching the gospel to the masses. In Florence, the Franciscans found the church and convent of Santa Croce, while the Dominicans found that of Santa Maria Novella. The first large city squares open in front of these churches to make room for the masses of the faithful who crowd to hear the sermons. Art illustrates for us man's new relation with the divine. The more human aspects of the life of Christ are accentuated, such as his suffering on the cross and the despair of his mother. At the beginning of the 1200s, about 200 tower houses, wedged in between bell towers and lookout posts, characterized the city's physiognomy. As much as 70 meters in height, these habitations exploit the scarce building space within the walls to the utmost. Compressed into the narrow alleys, the tower houses, or the fortified dwellings of the noble families, who generally have the right to accede to public posts, divided into the two opposing factions of Guelphs and Ghibellines. Comfort in the home is sacrificed to the need for defense. The rooms are poorly lit and connected by steep staircases. In order to increase their safety, allied families build their tower houses near one another, so as to form secure fortified nuclei inside the city, the so-called consortories. The stunning increase in commercial activities during the course of the 1200s translates into a new urban order. A new and much wider circle of walls is built between 1284 and 1334, which will contain city development right up to the 1800s. Within the walls, the religious and political centers take on their present aspects, Piazza Duomo and Piazza della Signoria. Ponte Vecchio, populated by butchers' shops, is joined by 3 other bridges which connect the two shores of the river Arno. Dante Alighieri is born in Florence in 1265. For the young poet, well versed in European culture, poetry is the means with which to express his noble love for Beatrice Portinari, his ideal woman, who, according to the poetics of the Dolce Stil Nuovo, becomes the intermediary between man and God. It is especially after the death of Beatrice that Dante takes an active part in political life. In 1302, the victory of the opposing party condemns him to exile. Far from Florence, he writes the Divine Comedy, the work with which he becomes the father of the Italian language. His imaginary voyage through the 3 ultra-terrestrial worlds is a synthesis of medieval knowledge. Historical figures, alongside his contemporaries, populate the agonizing infernal abyss and the Mount of Purgatory. In Paradise, he is guided by Beatrice to the ineffable vision of God. Dante's tormented relation with Florence emerges out of the work. The poet will never make a return to his city, which, though deeply loved, he condemns for its customs and political choices. Buried in Ravenna, the Florentines erected a funeral monument to his memory, which remains empty. Comparable to a gigantic illustrated book, the medieval church divulges the precepts of Christian doctrine by means of great decorative cycles. The tension before the transcendent world leads to a type of representation in which the figures are far removed and immaterial presences, immersed in the unreal space of a gold background. The splendor and terribleness of the divine emerge in the mosaics in the vault of the baptistry. Among the local masters who work here, Coppo di Marcovaldo earns distinction, and it is perhaps in this occasion that the first great Florentine painter begins his activity, Cimabue. Halfway through the 1200s, this artist impresses a turning point in the history of painting. He restores a new humanity to sacred figures, who are represented with dramatic accents. The road opened by Cimabue is traveled towards revolutionary consequences by his disciple Giotto di Bondone. Giotto's figures, even after centuries, have a new concreteness. Volumes occupy a measurable space. Their gestures are natural and accompany the expression of their faces. Abandoning the gold background, the painter sets his sacred stories among modern constructions and real furnishings. The great prestige of Giotto is shown in the number of works entrusted to artists of his school. Following the master's death, the fortune of his well-organized studio continues and exercises a kind of monopoly on the art market. In the second half of the 1300s, his style continues to inspire the grandiose compositions that decorate Santa Maria Novella. During the Middle Ages, the economic and social recovery of Florence is evinced in the construction of monuments which remain qualifying elements of today's city. The Church of San Miniato, begun in 1018, constitutes an original interpretation of the Romanesque style. The construction is covered with green structure of its interior, mosaic decoration of the city is transformed into an immense construction site. The Palazzo of the Commune is built and successively called Palazzo Vecchio. In 1296 begins the construction of the Duomo, the cathedral, which continues throughout all of the 1300s. In 1334, the prestigious post of construction master of the Duomo is entrusted to Giotto. To him we owe the project of the bell tower, a totally new construction compared with traditional models. Alongside the more important buildings, thanks to abundant private donations, the churches of Santa Croce and Santa Maria Novella are built. In 1382, the Loggia della Signoria is completed. The construction of the loggia, in close relation with the Palazzo del Comune, is ordered by the Florentine government to host public ceremonies as if in an outdoor hall. The attenuation of political conflicts in Florence in the 1300s contributes to the birth of a new sort of noble home, the palazzo. The only well-preserved example remaining is Palazzo d'Avanzati, today the venue of the Museum of the Florentine Home. The homes of nobles and wealthy merchants, though preserving several of the defensive features of the tower houses, now develop in spaciousness, often around a courtyard, and have large windows on the facade. On the ground floor, the originally open loggia is the site of negotiations and meeting place on the occasion of weddings and funerals. Access to the residence, though, is afforded by the street door, which opens onto the inner courtyard. From here, various staircases connect the different independent floors, which are served by a single well. One of the characteristics of this type of residence is the pictorial decoration of the walls, which imitates the use of fabrics hung to protect from the cold. In this period, the use of the fireplace takes root in substitution of the old heating system with braziers. The kitchen is situated on the top floor, both to facilitate the escape of vapors and smoke, as well as to circumscribe the danger of fire. This was the scene of most of a woman's life, the place where she cooked, spun, and wove. The history of 15th century Florence is characterized by the rise to power of the Medicis, a powerful family of bankers and merchants. In 1434, the shrewd Cosimo de' Medici becomes lord of the city, inaugurating a dynasty destined to reign until the 1700s. Cosimo the Elder and his grandson Lorenzo the Magnificent become promoters of a policy of equilibrium between the states which then compose the peninsula, among which Florence assumes a role of prestige. The alliances stipulated by the Medicis with the other Italian powers guarantee 15th century Florence long periods of peace. In this favorable climate, the city can invest sums once destined to wars in the development of artisan, commercial, and banking enterprises. Florence at that time lives one of its magic moments, characterized by an extraordinary circulation of capital. Private spending for building and the arts also increases at an amazing rate. The city is transformed into a splendid treasure chest of architecture, painting, and sculpture of inestimable value. New investments give a boost to the production of luxury objects, from processes performed on precious metals to those on valuable fabrics, which not only embellish Florentine homes, but also find a place on markets throughout Europe. In culture, the triumphant middle class supports humanist studies on classic Greek and Latin culture. Cosimo de' Medici himself promotes the foundation of the celebrated Neoplatonic Academy. Ancient culture becomes the model to follow for 15th century man and artist. Thus, the Renaissance is born. Lorenzo the Magnificent in 1469 succeeds his father, Piero the Gouty, as head of the Florentine Republic. At that time, Lorenzo is 21 years old and has had the leading minds of his time as teachers. Educated at an early age in the wiles of politics and diplomacy by his grandfather Cosimo, Lorenzo is at the same time a poet capable of composing verses in Latin. He loves to surround himself with poets, artists, and men of letters. He opens the doors of his house to an authority on classical languages such as Poliziano, who will serve as tutor to his children, and he cultivates the talent of Michelangelo, to whom he provides the means to continue his training. The cultural environment created by Lorenzo favors intimacy between men of letters and artists who find inspiration in each other's work. Lorenzo is moreover a lover of antiquity and an avid collector of precious objects, cameos, coins, vases of semi-precious stones, and sculpture of every epoch. Lorenzo's collection finds a place in the Casino di San Marco, where a new type of art school is being born. Here, young men like Michelangelo practice copying the ancient works of art, thus learning proportions, following teaching methods which anticipate those of modern art schools. The economy of 15th century Florence flourishes thanks to the network of commercial and financial ties created already in the previous century between the major European capitals by merchants and bankers. Florentine bankers, like the merchants before them, opened branch offices throughout Europe, providing services such as money lending at an interest and the international transfer of currency. A large part of the fortune of these undertakings is tied to the economic relations with the papacy and leading monarchies. As early as the 14th century, European royalty turned to Florentine banks for the transfer of capital abroad and for loans, to which they often resort to support the expenses of war. This is the case of Charles the Temerarious, Duke of Burgundy, who by means of loans finances his conflict with the King of France, or Edward IV of York, who resorts to the Medici for a loan during the War of Roses. The widespread use of loans makes it possible to limit the circulation of cash money, which is substituted by the letter of credit, forebear of the modern check. Once the merchant has contacted the branch office, he receives the sum he requires and is free to undertake negotiations, thus avoiding the risk of being robbed during his journey. The origins of the Medici family date back to 1200. The historical branch of the family opens with Giovanni di Bicci, father of Cosimo de' Medici. The Medicis deeply impress signs of their presence on the city, leaving us admirable masterpieces of architecture, painting, and sculpture. The transformation of Florence's aspect is principally the initiative of Cosimo the Elder, lord of the city as of 1434. A lover of the arts, Cosimo shows a marked preference for architecture, which he views as a tool to express the prestige of his family. Medici family wealth is so great that in 1441, Cosimo takes on the expense for the reconstruction of the ancient Basilica of San Lorenzo. While reconstruction of the church is underway, church destined to become the family sanctum, Cosimo decides to build his own residence in the vicinity. The building, which stands in Via Larga, will be inhabited by the family until 1540, when the Medicis, who have become dukes, move into Palazzo Vecchio. Cosimo's palace becomes a model for the noble residences of the Renaissance, from Palazzo Rucellai to Palazzo Strozzi. Lorenzo the Magnificent in 1469 succeeds his father, Piero the Gouty, as head. Painting in 15th century Florence is subjected to a radical process of renewal, followed by the gradual abandonment of the decorative, fairy tale style typical of the International Gothic. The principal innovator is Masaccio, who applies to painting the rules of geometric perspective experimented by Brunelleschi. The lesson of Masaccio will be picked up during the first half of the 15th century by Beato Angelico. Paolo Uccello, too, studies with interest the new method and its possibilities of application. The theme of the conquest of space by man fascinates Andrea del Castagno and runs throughout the second half of the century, finding sensitive interpreters in Pollaiolo and Verrocchio, who will deeply influence Sandro Botticelli, the most famous interpreter of profane subjects, in which female beauty is exalted by the fluidity of lines. These studies are not extraneous to the young Leonardo da Vinci, who concentrates his own on the relations of man with space and man with the atmosphere, setting the premises for the great works of his maturity. Other artists, such as Domenico Ghirlandaio, narrate the life of the times, and sacred tales become the pretext to describe customs and figures of the wealthy Florentine middle class. The history of 15th century sculpture opens with Donatello, who, together with Brunelleschi and Masaccio, can be rightly considered as one of the initiators of the Renaissance. The artist formulates his own personal language, destined to exercise a strong influence on Renaissance sculptors and painters. With him, the heroic concept of man, so typical of the 15th century, takes shape in sculpture. Donatello's figures break free of the background which held them anchored in the Gothic period and take possession of the surrounding space, acting in it. Their faces are characterized by a marked realism, joined by a quest for expressiveness of great intensity. During the second half of the 15th century, the studies of artists are prevalently aimed at solving the problem of the figure's dynamism in space. At the end of the century, Michelangelo begins his activity. The artist immediately identifies his ideal masters in Giotto, Masaccio, and Donatello, whose works he studies attentively. The influence of Donatello is evident in several of his youthful works. up along Viale dei Colli, the city to our backs, were inaugurated. The author of this transformation, completed between 1865 and 1870, is the architect Giuseppe Poggi. At the center of the square, with its panoramic view over Florence, is the monument to Michelangelo, composed of reproductions in bronze of several of his works. Back against the hill, Giuseppe Poggi's Palazzina del Caffè, and behind, on its old bastions, stands the church of San Salvatore al Monte, built in the Renaissance. The attenuation of political conflicts in Florence in the 1300s Lorenzo the Magnificent dies in 1492, and his son Piero becomes Lord of Florence. When in 1494 the French cross through Italy, directed towards the Kingdom of Naples, the Medicis, guilty of not obstructing their passage, are driven out. A republican government is then formed, initially led by Girolamo Savonarola. In 1512, the Medici family is reinstated in Florence, and in the years following, 2 of its members are named Pope with the names of Leo X and Clement VII. After the sack of Rome by the imperial troops, Florence again drives out the Medicis, who will finally be reinstated in 1530 with the title of dukes. The first Duke of Tuscany, Alessandro, is succeeded by Cosimo I, who takes on the title of Grand Duke and transfers his residence to Palazzo Vecchio. The Grand Dukes substitute the republican institutions with a monarchical regime, apply a policy of centralization, and promote the realization of new works. A boost is given to luxury craftsmanship, promoting tapestry weaving, ceramics, and the institution of the Opificio delle Pietre Dure. Worthy of mention on the cultural scene are the Florentine Literary Academy and the Accademia Linguistica della Crusca, which begins its formidable undertaking of the dictionary. On May 23, 1498, Friar Girolamo Savonarola and 2 other Dominicans were hanged and burnt alive. A monk at the convent of San Marco, Savonarola had devoted himself to denouncing the vices of both clergy and people, condemning the pagan spirit of the Renaissance, the wantonness of Florence, and the Rome of the Borgias. Having played the role of protagonist in the fall of the Medicis, Savonarola had become the head of the Florentine Republic. With the support of his followers called Piagnoni, whiners, moaners, Savonarola passionately preached the reform of customs, forbidding luxury and the vain elegance of women, suppressing holidays and games. Artists were deeply struck by the message of the reformer, and among these Botticelli, who suppressed the mythological subjects of his repertory in favor of religious themes. Mystic exaltation reached its peak in 1497, when, during Carnival, citizens offered a public burning of luxury clothing, books, and works of art with pagan subjects. The Republic of Savonarola was to be short-lived, also because the economy of Florence was prevalently based on the luxury products the monk attempted to ban. Finally, polemics with the papacy provoked the anger of Alexander VI, who excommunicated the friar. Arrested, subjected to torture and trial, Savonarola, condemned to death, was hanged and burned in Piazza della Signoria. The period of the Grand Duchy opens another phase of architectural interventions on the city, which evidence the altered political climate. Cosimo I In the first decade of the 15th century, Leonardo da Vinci was in Florence, where he painted, among other works, the celebrated portrait Mona Lisa. In it, he reached a high point in his striving for atmospheric effects, assimilating the figure into the landscape. Another great figure in the world of 15th century Florentine painting was Raphael Sanzio, who produced a series of Madonna with Child paintings and some portraits commissioned by the rich bourgeoisie. Already in these works, we can see the careful study of composition and the prodigious control of the means of expression which would reach a peak in the works of the so-called Roman period. Artists such as Pontormo and Rosso Fiorentino refused to imitate the style of Leonardo, Michelangelo and Raphael, who even at that time were considered insurpassable. They chose instead to develop their own personal means of expression. They took their inspiration from what was most strange in the works of the three great masters, and adapted it to their own particular narrative needs. In their works, which are dominated by acidic tones, bodies are elongated and deformed. Faces express tormented anxiety and uncertainty. The idea of space is non-existent, and the whole takes on a surreal aspect. In the second half of the century, painting, having lost this dramatic edge, saw the emergence of court painters such as Vasari, who transformed Palazzo Vecchio with paintings and frescoes, and Bronzino, portrait artist to the ducal family. Who even at that time were considered insurpassable. They chose instead to develop their own personal means of expression. They took their inspiration from what was most strange in the works of the three great masters, and adapted it to their own particular narrative needs. In their works, which are dominated by acidic tones, bodies are elongated and deformed. Faces express tormented anxiety and uncertainty. The idea of space is non-existent, and the whole takes on a surreal aspect. In the second half of the century, paint goes. The figure Dukedom begins in 1530 with a series of architectural and prestigious urbanistic interventions with which the Medicis affirm their dominion over the city. The artist who becomes interpreter of the wishes of the absolute sovereign Cosimo I is Giorgio Vasari, who completely renews the interior of the new ducal palace, leaving the external medieval structure intact. The organization of the absolute state continues with the construction of the Uffizi, which brings under one roof the guilds and the administrative offices of the state. Palazzo Pitti, the Medici residence as of 1565, has a courtyard and an immense garden created on the grounds of the hill of Boboli. In the same year, on the occasion of the wedding between Francesco I with Johanna of Austria, Palazzo della Signoria is connected with Palazzo Pitti by a corridor that passes over the Uffizi and Ponte Vecchio, which Vasari builds in only 4 months. From then on, Palazzo della Signoria maintains only the function of center of political power and takes the name of Palazzo Vecchio. The Grand Ducal era also sees the intensification of ties with the countryside, visible in the construction of country villas, such as the one at Pratolino that Francesco I built for Bianca Cappello, or the one at Artimino, the hunting residence of Ferdinando I. Lorenzo the Magnificent dies in 1492, and his son Piero becomes Lord of Florence. When in 1494, the 1600s is marked by the slow decline of Medici power and wealth. In this century, Florence lives a period of profound economic and cultural crisis, in which epidemics and famines are accompanied by the final splendors of court. In the 1600s, upon the death of Giangastone Medici, the rise to power of the Lorraines, related to the Habsburgs, opens an era of renewal and reforms owing to the work of illuminated sovereigns like Pietro Leopoldo. At the end of the century, the city is occupied by Napoleonic troops and stripped of numerous works of art. The restoration of the Lorraines in 1814 sees the continuation of a process of reforming the state which had begun in the 1700s and involves numerous interventions on the city and territory. With the first uprisings of the Risorgimento, the Lorraines are forced to abandon the city, which in 1860 becomes part of the Kingdom of Sardinia and then of the Kingdom of Italy. Leonardo da Vinci had demonstrated that experience is never wrong. 1 century later, another Tuscan, Galileo Galilei, conducts studies founded on the direct observation of nature. Galileo discovers the laws of the pendulum and performs important studies on the gravity of bodies. In 1609, he builds the telescope with lenses, which he utilizes to observe the heavenly bodies, that permits him to discover the 4 satellites of Jupiter, which he names Medicean stars, in honor of Grand Duke Cosimo II. With his studies, he demonstrates the veracity of Copernican theory, which affirms that the planets revolve around the sun, and not, as affirmed by the Church, around the earth. This assertion earns him the hostility of ecclesiastic authorities, who accuse him of contradicting the Holy Scriptures. The scientist is tried and condemned to life imprisonment, but, thanks to the intercession of the Medicis, his sentence is commuted to forced residence in the Villa of Arcetri in Florence, near the place where today stands the Astronomical Observatory. The Medicis render him a final honor with his burial in the Church of Santa Croce and the foundation, in 1657, of the Accademia del Cimento, the first scientific institution in Europe for the study of experimental physics. Leonardo da Vinci had demonstrated the rigorous norms of simplification established by the Counter-Reformation with regards to representing religious themes have an evident influence on the art of the beginning of the 1600s. Alongside devotional works destined to the public, the painting of private interiors wins affirmation, with allegorical and biblical subjects, characterized by the taste for dress and melodramatic accents. In the 1600s, the city has by now lost its central role of the previous centuries, but the artists called to Florence by the Grand Dukes, such as Artemisia Gentileschi and Pietro da Cortona, make possible an updating on Caravaggio and Baroque painting. Painting with a religious or allegorical subject is joined by a vein of popular subjects. The fresco decoration of noble homes, which in the 1600s had seen the activity of Pietro da Cortona in Palazzo Pitti and Luca Giordano in Palazzo Medici Riccardi, continues in the 1700s with the works of the Venetian Sebastiano Ricci in Palazzo Marruccelli. The 1700s also see religious or allegorical themes and portraiture joined by landscapes of Venetian inspiration. At the beginning of the 1800s, personal interpretations of romantic themes are proposed in painting, while in sculpture, the personality of Lorenzo Bartolini emerges. Under the liberal government of the last Lorraines, artists and men of letters from all over Italy come to Florence, where they meet at the Café Michelangelo. It is here in about 1855 that the poetics of the Macchiaioli The 1600s is marked by the slow decline of Medici power and wealth. In this century, in 1865, the capital of the Kingdom of Italy is moved from Turin to Florence. To adapt the city to its new functions of center of power, a plan of urban expansion is promoted, which, by destroying the medieval circle of walls, connects the historic center to the new quarters. The members of government transfer their residences to Florence, and the city's social life receives a great boost. The great building fervor and economic boom come to a halt in 1871, when the seat of government is transferred to Rome. Florence then lives a period of isolation, from which it seems to emerge only in the 1900s, with the birth of reviews such as Leonardo, Lacerba, and La Voce, which attract the important intellectuals of the period. During World War II, many areas of the city are bombed, and all of the bridges, with the exception of Ponte Vecchio, are destroyed. 2 decades later, in 1966, a flood inflicts a serious blow on the artistic legacy of Florence. The love for the city and its art treasures brings voluntary help and manifestations of solidarity from all over the world, thanks to which the city can again show its splendid aspect of before. In recent years, to combat the degradation caused by pollution, important restorations of monuments have been performed, which make Florence an open-air gallery unique in the world. A strong boost in the city's growth arrives in the second half of the 1800s, when Florence is proclaimed capital of the Kingdom of Italy. The new urban layout, necessary to connect the city with the new quarters located outside of the walls, is entrusted to Giuseppe Poggi. The 14th century walls are knocked down, and in their place come the tree-lined avenues that follow the example of the Parisian boulevards. The gates are spared, however, and like monuments all around the city, they open up onto new squares. This concept of the city as a monument produces the Lungarni, the avenues along the river Arno, and the Piazzale Michelangelo with its function of panoramic terrace. Several areas of the old center are restructured according to the new neoclassic style, with a series of interventions which at times sacrifice the city's medieval character. Following World War II, the city expands considerably with the building of new districts, which in recent years, a new town planning scheme has attempted to rationalize. A strong boost in the city's growth arrives in the necessary to connect the A strong boost in the city's growth arrives in the During the 1800s, Florence is one of the fundamental labs in the cultural formation of Italian and foreign artists. The trips that Florentine artists make abroad keep them updated on the art beyond the Alps. It is the moment of the macchiaioli and of the poetics of the open-air studio, for many aspects close to French Impressionism, championed by artists such as Signorini, Lega, and Fattori. At the end of the century, the first influences of the Art Nouveau style reach Florence, and are mildly welcomed by painter and ceramics designer Galileo Chini and by architect Giovanni Michelazzi. In the years preceding World War I, artists and men of letters gather around Florentine reviews such as Leonardo, La Voce, and La Cerva. On the pages of the latter appear important contributions to Futurism. Alongside the recovery of classical art, the years between the two wars sees an updating of the themes of rationalism, an important testimony of which is the railway station of Santa Maria Novella. 1933 sees the birth of the Maggio Musicale Fiorentino, an event which still today attracts the participation of many artists, sought after as set and costume designers. The city's artistic vocation is still expressed today in the organization of important exhibitions and events of international stature. During the Roman period, the vicinity of the river to the area of today's Piazza della Signoria favored the building of a monumental bath. Near this site of leisure and recreation, an important laboratory for dyeing fabrics was located. The aspect of the area completely changes during the Middle Ages. High towers, fortified noble dwellings, and bell towers jut out of narrow alleys. In 1299, the Commune of Florence decrees the construction of Palazzo Vecchio. It is around this powerful building that in the course of the 1300s, Piazza della Signoria develops, obtained by progressively knocking down towers and building the Loggia dei Lanzi, destined for use in public ceremonies. The square takes on its present aspect under the Medici Grand Duchy. The Loggia dei Lanzi becomes a showcase of works of art. The Fountain of Neptune is created, and the high and impressive Mass of the Uffizi appears in the square's perspective. In the 1700s, the ancient terracotta pavement is substituted with slabs of pietra serena.
L'attuale Piazza della Repubblica costituiva il centro della Firenze romana. Qui sorgeva infatti il foro, che con il Campidoglio, la basilica e le botteghe assolveva le funzioni civili, religiose e commerciali della città. Il passaggio dalla romanità al Medioevo è ben documentato nei nuovi edifici sorti sulle antiche strutture romane. Vengono costruite alcune chiese, mentre grandi famiglie erigono imponenti torri che modificano il tessuto urbano circostante. L'area conserva la funzione di mercato cittadino. Soprattutto dal 200, qui si concentra l'attività di banchieri e commercianti, che abitano gli edifici soprastanti le botteghe. Alla fine del 500 viene eretta la Loggia del Pesce, opera del Vasari, oggi trasferita in Piazza dei Ciompi, e il centro della piazza è ancora occupato dalla Loggia dei Tavernai, punto di vendita e ristoro. Nell'Ottocento la piazza continuerà ad essere popolata da tettoie, tende e botteghe. Dopo la proclamazione di Firenze capitale, si decide per motivi di igiene e decoro il trasferimento del mercato e l'allargamento della piazza fino alle attuali dimensioni. L'intervento porterà alla demolizione di importanti edifici, civili e religiosi, della storia di Firenze.
Up along Viale dei Colli, the city to our backs, we reach Piazzale Michelangelo. Its birth dates back to when Florence was capital and the elegant boulevards were inaugurated. The author of this transformation, completed between 1865 and 1870, is the architect Giuseppe Poggi. At the center of the square, with its panoramic view over Florence, the church of San Lorenzo, on the site of the ancient basilica consecrated by St. Ambrose in the 4th century AD, was renewed with Romanesque forms 7 centuries later. In the 1400s, a further enlargement of the church was decided and entrusted to Brunelleschi by the Medicis, who shoulder the expense of the project and make it their private sanctum. The facade, of which there remain models by Michelangelo, was not completed. To the left of the church, passing by the cloister of San Lorenzo, we enter the Laurentian library, begun in 1524 by Michelangelo. Outside the church, walking down Via dell'Ariento, we approach the entrance to the Medici chapels, where we can visit Michelangelo's new sacristy, and the chapel of the princes, the sumptuous mausoleum of the Medici family, which Matteo Nigetti began to erect in 1604. Dante called it Il Bel San Giovanni. The baptistry, with its difficulty in dating, already existed in the 9th century, and probably in the course of 1100 its exterior was completely covered with green and white marbles arranged in geometric designs. 3 bronze doors of great beauty open onto the interior. The south door, completed in 1330, is the work of Andrea Pisano. Lorenzo Ghiberti is the author of the north and east doors. Michelangelo defined the latter door, completed in 1452, the door of paradise, for its incomparable elegance of execution. The interior, destined to house the baptismal font, is decorated with refined marbles and mosaics. The cupola mosaics, synthesis of excerpts from the Holy Scriptures, were created in the course of the 1300s by Venetian and Roman artists and Florentine students. up along the Dante Alighieri is born in Florence in 1265.